What if I told you that one of the most powerful books ever written was deliberately hidden from your Bible? That there's a story of rebellion, miracles, and unshakable faith that was once considered sacred, but later erased from the spotlight? The Book of Maccabees isn't fiction, it's history, and its exclusion raises a burning question. What were they trying to keep you from discovering? You see, not all lost books are myths. Some, like 1 Maccabees, were honored for centuries, until theology and politics collided. Suddenly, this bold account of Jewish resistance and divine intervention vanished from the Western canon. But why? Who decided it didn't belong? And what truths might it still hold for those willing to look deeper? This isn't just about ancient texts, it's about the spiritual legacy you were never taught, the courage of a family who defied an empire, the miracle that gave birth to Hanukkah, and the historical gap that shaped the world Jesus was born into. This isn't conspiracy, it's biblical history hidden in plain sight. If you've ever felt like there's more to the Bible than what you've been told, you're not alone. Behind these missing pages lies a story that could reignite your faith and challenge everything you thought you knew about Scripture. So buckle up, because once you open this door, there's no turning back. Imagine for a moment that there's an ancient, powerful book mostly ignored by the modern world. A book that tells a gripping saga of unshakable faith and resistance against relentless oppressors. That's exactly what the Book of Maccabees is, a forgotten treasure bursting with courage, miracles, and choices that reshaped Jewish faith. And yet, it was removed from most Western Bibles. So, you might be wondering, why hide something so profound? What many don't realize is that this book was excluded during the Protestant Reformation, when human decisions shaped what would and wouldn't be in the Bible. Meanwhile, traditions like the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the Book of Maccabees in full. And here we begin to see that biblical history isn't just divine, it's been filtered through politics and ideology. The Bible, it seems, has its own hidden edits. Honestly, this book reads like a secret code within the Bible mysteries. It tells a raw story of fiery resistance that still speaks volumes today. Who hasn't felt crushed under systems that seem too strong to fight? The story of the Maccabees reminds us that faith, combined with courage, becomes an unstoppable force. And let's face it, isn't that exactly what today's world is starving for? As you dive deeper, you meet men and women fighting not just earthly armies, but invisible forces trying to erase their identity. It's as if the Book of Maccabees cries out across the centuries, "Don't forget who you are." In a world constantly trying to define us, this message feels more relevant than ever. Think about it. How often do you silence yourself just to fit in? Many today are spiritually disconnected, and perhaps that's because stories like this were buried or downplayed. The Book of Maccabees is like a mirror. It reflects what happens when we fight for truth, even when outnumbered. This isn't about passive belief. It's about active, sweat and blood faith. Faith that doesn't flinch. Faith that pushes through fire. The book also exposes a truth many avoid. Real spirituality is uncomfortable. It doesn't pamper, it challenges. If you thought faith was just about peace and light, maybe you're reading the wrong texts. Try starting with this one, the Book of Maccabees, and then tell me if your outlook doesn't shift. It's not about avoiding battles, it's about being prepared to fight them. What's mind-blowing is how this ancient story perfectly mirrors today's struggles. Identity crises, freedom of belief, cultural erasure. Sound familiar? Of course it does. Because the seeds of biblical history are still growing, still stretching into our modern landscape. And once you recognize that, the whole spiritual game changes. Funny how people binge-watch fictional rebellions in movies, yet ignore real-life stories far more epic. The Maccabees' journey is more thrilling than any blockbuster, and it actually happened. Which begs the question, why do we prefer fiction over truth? Maybe because truth asks us to do something with it, and that's scary. The Book of Maccabees isn't just some forgotten chapter. It's a key piece in the puzzle of Bible mysteries, a hidden gem pulsing with ageless truth. This book dares us to rise, to reflect, and to reclaim spiritual integrity. Reading it is like hearing a whisper from above. Fight for what is eternal. And honestly, isn't that the kind of fire we need to rekindle? There's something almost prophetic about how this story vanished from the spotlight. Like a veil was drawn over it, shielding millions from its message. But for those who seek, for the spiritually curious, the veil is lifting. And as you follow this path of defiant faith, you'll soon discover who first lit the flame, and how that fire endured even in the darkest hours. History doesn't whisper here. It roars. During the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Jewish life faced its darkest hour. Worship was outlawed, sacred texts were burned, and the Holy Temple itself was desecrated. This wasn't just political tyranny, it was spiritual warfare. And in this silence of faith, something ancient began to stir. Imagine waking up one day and discovering your faith is now illegal. No more prayers, no more traditions, no more Torah scrolls. That's the reality the Jewish people faced. They weren't just losing freedom, they were being erased. Yet even in this bleakness, the seeds of resistance took root, seeds that would later bloom into what we now find in the Book of Maccabees. This chapter of biblical history is one of the clearest portraits of oppression. But not just the kind that breaks bones, the kind that breaks identity. Antiochus wasn't content with ruling, he wanted assimilation. Sound familiar? In today's world, the pressure to conform isn't so different. Whether it's subtle or blatant, the battle for your soul is still very real. The Maccabees didn't start with swords, they started with outrage. Real, holy, sacred outrage. The kind of deep stirring in your chest that tells you, enough. And from that sacred frustration came movement, leadership, fire. The kind of inner rebellion that can only be born from conviction. That's the spark that the Book of Maccabees refuses to let us forget. If you've ever felt like you're swimming against the current, maybe at school, at work, even in your own home, then you already understand this fight. The world often ridicules conviction. It tells you to blend in, tone it down, go with the flow. But truth doesn't flow. It stands. And when the Maccabees stood, the ground trembled. There's something timeless about what they faced. Books burned, beliefs mocked, identity targeted. History repeats, not because it forgets, but because we do. That's why rediscovering these stories in the Book of Maccabees is more than learning. It's remembering. It's reconnecting with a spiritual lineage that defied darkness with light. Even the smallest act of defiance mattered. A whispered prayer, a hidden scroll, a secret gathering. These weren't just moments of survival. They were declarations of war. And every time they chose faith over fear, they carved a new line in the soul of their people. This is what true spiritual resilience looks like. You don't need to lead a rebellion to rise against oppression. Sometimes, it starts by saying no. No to what dims your light, no to what steals your peace, no to the lies that tell you you're alone. And just like that, your life starts echoing the courage found in the Bible mysteries of the Maccabees. Let's not romanticize this. They lost homes, lives, and loved ones, but they kept their soul. And isn't that what's really under attack today? In a world that's louder than ever, the quiet conviction of these rebels still speaks. And it's asking you, what would you risk to remain true to what matters most? What rose in them wasn't just resistance, it was restoration. The kind that doesn't come from power, but from purpose. And as their movement grew, so did the hope that maybe, just maybe, faith could still rise from the ashes. But to understand how that flame became a fire, we have to follow it into the wilderness. There comes a moment when silence becomes betrayal. For Mattathias, that moment came when he was told to offer a pagan sacrifice. Surrounded by compromise, this aging priest stood tall, watching others bow to the pressures of the empire. But, instead of complying, he drew his blade and struck down both the traitor and the officer. That one act lit a fire history couldn't extinguish. Mattathias's cry, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law follow me," wasn't just a call to arms. It was a line in the sand. Imagine being there, feeling the tension in the air, the fear of retaliation, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally take a stand. That kind of courage isn't taught, it's ignited. And that moment is forever etched in the Book of Maccabees. His defiance reminds us that spiritual leadership isn't about comfort, it's about clarity. Mattathias didn't wait for approval or a perfect plan. He saw what was wrong and he acted. In today's world, how often do we wait until it's too late to speak up? Sometimes leadership looks like being the first to say, "No more." This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was sacred resistance, a refusal to betray the covenant, even when it came at great cost. And just like that, a revolution was born, not in palaces, but in the wilderness. Isn't it interesting how some of the greatest moves of God begin far from the spotlight? Mattathias didn't just make a statement, he started a movement. Alongside his sons, he fled to the hills, leaving behind comfort for conviction. His home became a battleground. His faith became his shield. That's the kind of legacy most of us dream of leaving. Not success by the world's standards, but faithfulness in the face of fear. Think of the courage it takes to say no when everyone else says yes. Whether it's peer pressure, workplace ethics, or standing up for your values in tough conversations. This moment shows us how to respond. You don't need a crowd to validate you. Just one reason worth fighting for. The Book of Maccabees captures this moment with raw honesty. It doesn't glamorize the decision, it honors the sacrifice. Mattathias gave up safety, stability, and the approval of men. But he gained something far greater, alignment with truth. And in the grand tapestry of biblical history, that's what truly echoes. We often think boldness is about volume, but it's really about values. Mattathias wasn't the loudest. He was the clearest. His stand teaches us to anchor our actions in what's eternal, not just what's trending. And in doing so, we become part of something far bigger than ourselves, something holy. If you've ever felt outnumbered, take heart. One voice can still shake empires. One decision can still turn tides. That's the message embedded deep in these Bible mysteries. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more clarity. And Mattathias gave us that, not with a sermon, but with a sword. But the story doesn't stop in the wilderness. What he began, his sons would carry forward. And among them, one would rise with the strength of a lion and the wisdom of a prophet. His name? Judas Maccabeus. And his legacy would reshape history. When Mattathias passed the torch, it didn't flicker. It roared. His son, Judas Maccabeus, rose not just as a warrior, but as a symbol, a leader who fused faith and strategy, prayer and power. He wasn't just swinging swords, he was lifting hearts. And through him, the Book of Maccabees shifts from rebellion to revolution. Judas wasn't chosen by title, but by action. In the face of overwhelming odds, he became a commander who knew when to fight and when to kneel. His leadership wasn't built on charisma alone, it was rooted in covenant. That's what made him different. In a world filled with noise, he listened for divine whispers. The battles he led weren't just against soldiers, they were against despair. The Battle of Emmaus, for example, wasn't won by sheer force. It was won by hope and timing, by believing the impossible could still happen. That's why he's remembered not just in biblical history, but in every heart that dares to believe again. Think of him as a David for his generation. Strategic, fearless, and deeply grounded. He didn't just want freedom, he wanted holiness. That distinction matters, because when you fight for the sacred, your cause carries eternity. And Judas understood that with every breath he took. One of the most powerful things about his leadership was how contagious it was. He inspired farmers to become fighters, priests to become protectors, and doubters to become dreamers. That's the kind of influence born in the fire of purpose. When your why is clear, the how starts to reveal itself. He led with a heart ablaze. But make no mistake, Judas wasn't reckless. His tactics at the Battle of Beth Zur showed precision and divine trust. He positioned his men, then prayed. Not the kind of prayer that avoids action, but the kind that fuels it. That balance, rare and revolutionary. His journey in the Book of Maccabees gives us a blueprint for modern leadership. Stand firm, be wise, seek God before strategy. It's a model for anyone facing giants, whether in business, family, or personal battles. If you lead anything in life, Judas has something to teach you. Let's be honest. We live in a world obsessed with power. But Judas showed us power under submission. He didn't worship the sword. He wielded it with purpose. There's a big difference, and maybe that's why his legacy still burns through the ages, wrapped in the mystery of the Bible mysteries. The thing is, Judas never saw himself as a hero. He was simply a servant who stepped up. He didn't wait for the perfect conditions. He led in the chaos. That's a word for anyone feeling unprepared today. God doesn't always call the qualified, but He equips the willing. And just when the victories begin to swell and hope returns to the people, Judas turns his eyes to something more than battles. A sacred place defiled, a city aching for light. And it's here, in the shadow of the temple, that we witness a miracle that still burns bright. The victory wasn't complete until the heart of the people was restored. And for Judas Maccabeus, that meant one thing: the temple. It stood, desecrated and broken, like a symbol of all that had been taken. But within those shattered stones, he saw more than ruins. He saw renewal, and so began one of the most sacred acts in biblical history. Jerusalem had been reclaimed, but holiness had to be rebuilt. The altar was defiled, the sanctuary polluted, and every sacred object had been corrupted by pagan rituals. But Judas and his people didn't despair. They rolled up their sleeves and began to cleanse what others had defiled. This wasn't just restoration, it was redemption in motion. They tore down the altar, rebuilt it with new stones, and purified every inch of the temple. Think of it like cleaning out your soul, piece by piece, intentionally, reverently. That's what the Maccabees did. And what emerged wasn't just a physical structure. It was the rebirth of faith, a testimony carved in action. Then came the lighting of the menorah. The golden lampstand, long darkened, was to shine once more. But there was a problem. Only enough sacred oil for one day. Still, they lit it anyway, because faith doesn't wait for ideal conditions. And what happened next? The oil lasted not 1, but 8 days. A miracle that defied logic and history alike. This is where the tradition of Hanukkah is born, not from wealth or power, but from obedience and hope. It's not just about candles or gifts. It's about the impossible becoming possible when we dare to trust. And every flickering flame still whispers that truth today. The Book of Maccabees captures this moment like a sacred heartbeat. Hanukkah means dedication, and that's exactly what this was. A generation rededicating themselves to God, not just the temple. It was as much about inner transformation as it was about public ritual. And honestly, that's a message we still need, because the real temple God wants clean is you. The menorah didn't burn because of abundance. It burned because of faith. One small jar, one simple act, and heaven responded. That's how the supernatural works. It partners with your yes, whether it's one prayer, one gesture of kindness, or one bold choice. Miracles often start where logic ends. Hanukkah is a celebration, yes, but it's also a challenge. It asks, what in your life needs to be rededicated? What have you allowed to remain dark, thinking the oil had run out? Maybe it's time to light that wick again and let God handle the rest. Judas and his people did, and heaven showed up. This story isn't ancient. It's alive. Every year, the menorah burns as a symbol that faith still works, that light still wins, and that holiness can be reclaimed. It's not just history. It's invitation to believe again, to rebuild, to burn brightly even when all you have is one day's worth of oil. But the light came at a cost. Not everyone survived the battles. And as we look deeper into the pages of the Book of Maccabees, we find stories of unimaginable sacrifice and faith that refused to bow. Some stories are so powerful they pierce through time. The Book of Maccabees brings us one of them, a mother and her 7 sons, faced with death for refusing to eat pork. It wasn't just food, it was a test of loyalty to God. And one by one, they chose faith over fear, their courage echoing across the corridors of biblical history. Imagine watching your children suffer, knowing you could stop it by saying just one word of compromise. But this mother? She stood firm, urging each son to remain faithful. Her voice, steady under pressure, became their anchor. She wasn't just a parent. She was a pillar of unshakable devotion. That's not just bravery. That's divine strength. These weren't warriors in armor. They were teenagers, sons with names, dreams, and laughter, cut short by cruelty. But in their final moments, they didn't curse God. They glorified Him. One even declared, "We are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our ancestors." That kind of faith makes history kneel. Their deaths weren't in vain. They sparked hope, stirred hearts, and became symbols of spiritual resilience. This wasn't martyrdom for fame. It was conviction embodied. And in every generation, their story rises again, reminding us what it means to stand when it would be easier to bow. Let's be real. This level of faith is rare. But it's not unreachable. It begins in small decisions. Choosing integrity over convenience, truth over comfort, and obedience over approval. The kind of choices you and I face every day. The Bible mysteries hidden in these texts whisper the same invitation. Stand, even if you stand alone. There's something haunting yet beautiful in how they faced death. Their peace wasn't natural. It was supernatural. That's the gift of faith refined in fire. And whether you're facing heartbreak, injustice, or loss, their story offers a blueprint. Suffer well, finish strong, and leave a legacy of light. The mother's words still ring with purpose. Do not fear this butcher, but prove worthy of your brothers. She wasn't just preserving tradition, she was defending eternity. And in her silent strength, we see the image of a God who never abandons His people, even in the darkest moments. We often want to skip to the miracles, but sometimes the miracle is endurance itself. To hold fast when everything inside you wants to let go. That's what they did. And it's what many still do today. Quiet heroes who choose faith in hospital rooms, in persecution, or in the silence of their own pain. The Book of Maccabees doesn't soften the horror, they honor it. Because suffering for righteousness shapes souls like nothing else. And those 7 brothers and their mother became eternal witnesses of what it looks like to live and die well. Their blood spoke when words were forbidden. Yet the story marches on. From the ashes of their sacrifice rose a new strength, and from that strength emerged a dynasty. One that would not only defend the faith, but redefine the course of a nation. Out of the ashes of war rose something entirely unexpected. A dynasty. With Judas Maccabeus gone, the mantle passed to his brothers, first Jonathan, then Simon. These weren't kings by birth, but by calling. And their leadership didn't just preserve faith, it re-established a nation. The Book of Maccabees shifts here from rebellion to governance. Jonathan stepped into a fractured world, one where enemies still lurked and internal doubts threatened the people's resolve. Yet with diplomacy and determination, he held the line. He secured peace, reclaimed land, and restored Jewish dignity. His leadership proved that strategy and spirituality are not enemies. They're allies when used in balance. Then came Simon, the steady hand. Under his rule, autonomy returned. The people were no longer just survivors, they were builders again. He restored cultural identity, defended religious freedom, and was honored as both prince and high priest. It wasn't about titles, it was about trust, and Simon earned it, one act of faith at a time. This chapter in biblical history shows us that sustaining a vision is just as miraculous as starting one. Revolutions often burn out, but Simon nurtured the flame. He gave the people not just safety, but purpose. That's a lesson for anyone who's ever built something. Passion starts it, but commitment sustains it. The Hasmonean dynasty wasn't flawless. It was human. There were political challenges, compromises, and tough decisions. But through it, all their foundation remained spiritual. Their authority was rooted not in conquest, but covenant. And that distinction made all the difference. We often glorify the battlefield, but Simon's chapter reminds us of the quiet heroism of administration, of rebuilding systems, laws, and lives. It's the less glamorous part of the story, but just as vital. Think about your own life. What needs rebuilding after your personal battles? Where could you lead, even quietly? The Hasmonean era also brought the people back into rhythm with sacred time, restoring temple services, festivals, and community rituals. These weren't just traditions, they were anchors. And in restoring them, Simon helped his people remember who they were. Identity isn't just taught, it's practiced daily. It's easy to think miracles only happen in fire and flash. But the dynasty proves they also live in structure, stability, and sacred routine. The mundane became meaningful again. That's one of the secrets inside the Bible mysteries. Sometimes, the most divine thing you can do is simply remain faithful. This dynasty gave the Jewish people space to breathe, grow, and worship in peace. It was more than politics. It was a spiritual reset. And in a world constantly shifting, that kind of foundation is priceless. We all need places, inner and outer, where our souls can rest and realign. But even dynasties face storms. And as we turn the page, we find deeper connections forming between the old heroes of Israel and the greater story yet to unfold. Because the footsteps of these Maccabean leaders were leading somewhere holy. To truly grasp the weight of the Book of Maccabees, we have to place it within the broader arc of biblical history. Judas Maccabeus didn't emerge from a vacuum. His story echoes the steps of giants like Moses, Joshua, and David. He stood at the intersection of faith and resistance, carrying the same spirit that parted seas, conquered lands, and wrote psalms in caves. Like Moses, Judas led his people through oppression. Like Joshua, he fought for sacred territory. And like David, he was both warrior and worshiper. These aren't just comparisons, they're confirmations. That God, in every generation, raises up those who won't settle for silence. Leaders who burn with purpose, not ambition. What's profound is how this period set the stage for something even greater. The spiritual and political climate shaped by the Maccabees became the very soil into which Jesus would be born. Without understanding this backdrop, much of the New Testament context fades. The tension, the hope, the hunger for a Messiah, it was all rooted in these earlier revolts. Even the Pharisees and Sadducees, who play major roles in the Gospels, rose to prominence during this time. The lines between religious devotion and political control were being drawn. And it's here that we see why the Book of Maccabees was so crucial. It captured the moment when the sacred and the civic collided in full force. The rededicated temple, the reformed identity, the revival of the Torah. All of this laid the groundwork for first-century Judaism. And whether one believes in Christ as Messiah or not, it's impossible to ignore how much of his story was informed by the world the Maccabees shaped. That's the hidden thread many readers miss. History didn't pause between Malachi and Matthew. It pulsed, it roared, and the Maccabean movement was at the heart of that pulse. It showed that God doesn't always speak in thunder. Sometimes he moves through strategy, resistance, and even rebellion. That's one of the most provocative ideas tucked inside the Bible mysteries. Judas's victories weren't isolated. They were part of a lineage. And just as David passed a legacy to Solomon, Judas handed something to the generations after him. The memory that faith is worth fighting for. That worship, identity, and truth are not just sacred, they're revolutionary. When we revisit these stories, we reconnect with that revolutionary spirit. We realize that what's old is still alive, still burning. It's not about nostalgia, it's about identity. And every time we trace these steps, we remember who we are and where we come from. That kind of memory has power. For those who want to go deeper, study how Jewish tradition evolved post-Maccabees. Compare the courage of Judas with the resolve of prophets. See how resistance became ritual and how survival became revival. It's all there, waiting to be explored, not just in history books, but in your heart. And as we piece these connections together, something remarkable emerges. A bridge, not just between Old and New Testaments, but between heaven and earth. And the question that lingers now is, what can we learn today from a world prepared for redemption? What if the Book of Maccabees wasn't just about the past, but about you? The stories of rebellion, miracles, and unshakable faith aren't meant to gather dust on ancient scrolls. They're alive. They pulse with timeless lessons that speak directly to our modern chaos. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it. A call to courage. The Maccabees didn't have perfect conditions. They faced overwhelming odds, betrayals, and grief. But they moved anyway. And isn't that what faith truly is? Not waiting for ideal circumstances, but trusting in the midst of uncertainty. That kind of faith still moves mountains and hearts. One of the clearest lessons is that spiritual freedom has a price. It requires boundaries, discipline, and resilience. You don't just drift into truth, you fight for it. And in today's world, where distractions abound and values shift like sand, the Maccabees challenge us to stand firm, not out of pride, but out of purpose. They also teach us the power of legacy. Judas didn't just win battles, he inspired generations. What legacy are you building? How will your convictions shape your children, your friends, your community? Legacy isn't about fame, it's about faithfulness over time. Quiet consistency builds eternal echoes. And let's not forget the strength in small beginnings. A single act of defiance, one oil jar, one mother's words. The Bible mysteries. Hidden in these moments reveal that God often starts big things in small places. So don't despise your little. That could be the spark that lights someone else's fire. Another key lesson? Obedience over outcome. The Maccabees didn't always know what would happen, but they obeyed anyway. That's where miracles are born, in the space between uncertainty and surrender. If you're facing a hard choice right now, remember, obedience is never wasted. They also call us to community. These weren't lone heroes. They fought together, prayed together, wept together. In a culture that idolizes independence, their unity is a refreshing reminder that we're stronger when we stand side by side. Who's in your corner? And whose corner are you standing in? Their story exposes how holiness isn't passive. It's powerful. Purifying the temple wasn't just symbolic, it was revolutionary. In your own life, what needs to be cleansed, realigned, rededicated? Start with one area. Maybe your thoughts, your habits, your time. Holiness starts where honesty begins. There's also a lesson in remembering. Hanukkah itself is a yearly reminder of resilience and light. But memory isn't just historical, it's spiritual. When you remember what God has done, you reclaim strength for today. Keep a journal. Speak testimonies. Pass down your story. Faith grows when it remembers. So what now? What will you do with what you've learned? The Maccabees didn't just make history. They invite you to make it too. You don't need a battlefield. You need boldness. The courage to be different, faithful, and unwavering. And as you step forward, remember, the flame they lit now burns in you. So now that you've seen what was hidden, what will you do with it? The Book of Maccabees isn't just a relic, it's a wake-up call. It reminds us that courage isn't born in comfort, and faith doesn't thrive in silence. Maybe this was the knowledge you didn't even know you were missing. But now that it found you, it's time to respond. What part of your life needs to be rededicated, just like that temple? Will you choose conviction over convenience? Truth over trend? Will you rise even quietly to protect the sacred spaces within you? Because here's the truth. You don't have to be a warrior to fight for your faith. Sometimes it just takes one choice, one act, one whisper of, "I believe." That's where revolutions begin. Ask yourself, what story am I writing with my life? Will it echo with compromise or courage? Will future generations look back and say you stood for something? That you remembered who you were when the world tried to make you forget? If this message stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What did this awaken in your heart? What new questions did it raise? And if you want to keep exploring the mysteries of Scripture, of history, and of spiritual truth, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're just getting started. And the next discovery may change everything you thought you knew. Let's walk this journey together. The flame of the Maccabees still burns. Now it's your turn to carry it forward.